Hello, class. This is lecture number 23 for History 101. And where we need to pick up is on page 257 in your textbook. We're going to talk about the election of 1828. Now, remember, Andrew Jackson has basically been campaigning for 4 years after he believed in his mind that he was shafted out of being president in 1824 by John Quincy Adams and the corrupt bargain, as he called it, he made with then Secretary of State Henry Clay. So, during this 4 years, what Andrew Jackson is going to do is he's going to create a brand new political party. Because remember, we had the Year of Good Feelings, then the election of 1824, nobody used a party designation. And if you look at your book on 257, now you'll notice we have party designations once again. Andrew Jackson is a Democrat. He's going to create the Democratic Party. John Quincy Adams is going to morph the old Democratic Republicans into what becomes known as the National Republican Party. Not to be confused with the Republican Party that exists today. That's still down the road. That party will be created in the 1850s. Now, Jackson will create the Democrat Party, and it's the same party in name, anyway, that exists today. So we have one of the two parties now operating that we still have today. Now, the way he creates this, Jackson will travel the country in those 4 years criticizing Adams and Clay's every move, like with the American system we talked about last class. And he'll talk to common, everyday men. Now remember, politically speaking, women don't count because they can't vote. And what's happening between 1824 and 1828 that Jackson is well aware of, public education comes online, and all the states between those two elections are going to drop their land qualifications for voting. So they're going to create what's known as universal suffrage for all white men. Jackson will key in on this, knowing there's going to be a sizable number of first-time voters, and that's who he campaigns to and forms a party around, the Democrats. So in this election, you'll notice that Jackson wins very easily this time, plus it's a two-person election. He'll receive nearly 140,000 more votes than President John Quincy Adams. Now, the amount that Jackson defeats Adams by is almost the amount that that Jackson had in total popular vote in the election of 1824. So we can really see how a sizable number of men vote for the very first time, especially if we take a look at the totals here. In the previous election of 1824, approximately 356,000 people voted. In the election of 1828, when now there's no restrictions, 1.1 million people vote. So they basically triple the number of voters. Jackson takes advantage of this and wins pretty handily. So he finally gets to fulfill his dream of being president of the United States. Now, inauguration will come up in March of 1829. Jackson will be sworn in as president, and he'll have quite the Inauguration Day celebration. And one thing we have to also consider about Andrew Jackson, He's the first American president from what we would consider at that point in history the West. He's from the state of Tennessee. And as we already have established, Jackson was a war hero, highly decorated in the War of 1812, the commander at the Battle of New Orleans. Jackson will later enter his political career and will rise to the position of governor of the state of Tennessee, then obviously to president of the United States. Now, he will invite practically everybody he knows from Tennessee to come to Washington, D.C. to help him celebrate his great victory. And it'll be quite a bash he throws. And in fact, according to newspaper reports of the time, the party that Jackson throws will rage on at the White House for nearly a week. At one point, about 4 days into Jackson's presidency, reporters go to the White House to interview him. And when they knock on the door, which you could back in this day and age, you could walk right up to the White House, knock on the door. One of Jackson's buddies from Tennessee answers the door and invites him in, and they're appalled at what's going on inside. People are whooping it up, drinking still 4 days later, smashing expensive china in the fireplaces, and trashing the White House. I guess Tennessee style. When the reporters say, "Where's President Jackson? We'd like to speak with him," they say, "Well, he's not here. He left a day or so ago. He's operating out of a hotel a couple blocks down the street so he can get some work done as this party rages on in the White House." So that's sort of how they start things, and the press is a bit set back by this. Then Jackson, in his first speech after inauguration, will announce that everyone who works for the federal government, obviously absent the military, is fired. And his reason why? He will not have anyone who worked for John Quincy Adams working for him. Now, back in this day and age, presidents could appoint every single person who worked for the federal government. There was no job classification or civil service. That won't come into place until the 1880s. And he could fire everybody, which he did. So, this obviously sets Washington, D.C. on its head. All the people that had worked for the Adams administration now are unemployed and had to leave. So Jackson will be in a long process of appointing all these people. He'll appoint his cabinet. And right off the bat, he'll have a bit of trouble in his cabinet when it's commonly known as the Peggy Eaton Affair. It involves his Secretary of War, John Eaton, who's a pretty close friend of his. John Eaton had married, after the death of his first wife, a young lady from Washington, D.C., Peggy. And Andrew Jackson was very close friends with Peggy Eaton's father, because her father was a tavern owner in Washington, D.C., and Jackson routinely rented a room over top of the tavern when he was staying in Washington from 1824 to 1828. So she was very good friends with her father and considered her almost like a daughter. Now, the rest of the cabinet wives, who were from upper class families and kind of stuffy and snobby, did not like Peggy Eaton, the daughter of a tavern keeper. And they looked down their noses at her. And as it turns out, they snub her and her husband and don't invite them to parties that Jackson's cabinet is routinely throwing. So one day it dawns on President Jackson, why in the world isn't Secretary of War Eaton at all these parties with his lovely young wife, Peggy? So he calls John Eaton into his office and says, how come you never go to any of these parties? And Secretary of War Eaton says, because we're never invited. Jackson is furious about this and instructs his cabinet, holds a cabinet meeting and says, from this point forward, you're going to invite everyone to one of these cabinet parties or no one. So that's the way it is. Now, you got to remember also, Andrew Jackson's going to sort of command his cabinet like a general would in the military. So he expects them to follow orders. Shortly thereafter, Eaton and his wife Peggy are invited, but pretty quick they're back to the norm of snubbing them. Jackson is so furious that he will fire all but 2 members of his cabinet for insubordination. And that's why this is known then, the Peggy Eaton Affair becomes commonly known as, quote unquote, Eaton's malaria, because it sort of kills off Jackson's cabinet. The only 2 people that maintain their positions are Secretary of War John Eaton and Secretary of State Martin Van Buren, who he trusts unconditionally. So, right off the bat, Jackson fires everyone who works for the federal government. It doesn't take long till he fires almost his whole cabinet. He is, quite a person, to say the least. His nickname is Old Hickory because he's as tough as a hickory branch or tree. So, Jackson, what's going to happen next in his administration is things will carry out. We'll be talking about Indian removal next lecture. Jackson is going to run into some problems towards the tail end of his first term in the White House in 1832 because a series of tariffs are passed, and in reality, the tariffs that are passed in 1832 and signed into law by Andrew Jackson are actual lowering of the tariffs, which should appease Southern farmers. But what had happened in the past under the Adams administration, tariffs had been significantly increased. And especially white Southern plantation owners were so furious about this that happened in the previous administration, they had decided that they're going to prepare in the future for the next tariff law. And what they were building up to is they were making plans that the next time Congress passed a law concerning the tariff, that they would attempt to nullify collecting of tariffs in each individual state. So what's going to happen here in 1832 is the Nullification Crisis, which you can see here on page 259 in your book, is where they cover this. Now, when these tariffs are passed, South Carolina is going to lead the charge here in this attempt to nullify tariffs, which means not collect them within each individual state boundary. So South Carolina passes a state law nullifying collection of federal tariffs within their state boundaries. Now, they base this concept on something we talked about before that happens way back in the Adams administration during the Alien and Sedition Acts. As you will remember, in response to the Sedition Acts and the jailing of people like Congressman Matt Lyon, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison will write the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which in essence nullified the Sedition Act within the state boundaries of Virginia and Kentucky. So South Carolina is going to use the same line of logic to nullify the tariff because they argue tariffs are unconstitutional, which they're not. Now, excuse me. The person that's going to lead the charge in South Carolina is no one less than the Vice President of the United States, who we have a portrait of this character in your book. Let me find it here for you. I thought we did. Where is that? There he is. On page 262, where it shows the Nullies in South Carolina, which we're talking about, there's John C. Calhoun, Vice President of the United States, former prominent politician from South Carolina. So he returns to his home state in 1832 and helps them pass this nullification. Now, this puts Andrew Jackson in a very precarious situation. Nullifying the tariff is clearly unconstitutional. There's something that we talked about before, how the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions was a case of two wrongs not making a right. There's something in the Constitution known as the Supremacy Clause, which makes federal laws, including tariffs, supreme over state laws. So the nullification laws are unconstitutional. South Carolina is sticking to their guns, saying we're nullifying it, we're not collecting any more tariffs, and they believe other southern states will follow suit. So what happens is Andrew Jackson has to make a stand here before the rest of the South all starts nullifying the federal tariff, which, remember, is the main source of revenue for the federal government at this point in history. No income taxes. So what Andrew Jackson announces is he gives South Carolina an ultimatum, gives them so many days to, what he says, and only Jackson can put it this way in this famous speech, to nullify nullification. And he tells them if they don't do it by a certain deadline, that he is going to invade South Carolina with the federal army, seize control of their state, and start arresting prominent South Carolinians for treason. And he basically shows them he's not fooling around, because during the time period of this ultimatum, the United States Army starts surrounding the state of South Carolina. He also points out in his speech that if they don't get rid of nullification, or nullify nullification as he puts it, first thing he's ordering his commanders to do is to locate who he believes is the top culprit in all this, his own vice president, John C. Calhoun, arrest him for treason, and immediately hang him for the crime. So, this is the ultimatum he gives to South Carolina and John C. Calhoun. South Carolina has a deadline of a week or whatever. So they're waiting and they're hoping that some other southern states will join them and also nullify the tariffs within their state boundaries. They're hoping, well, maybe their neighboring state of Georgia will do it next, and then Alabama and whatnot. Well, all the rest of these states took Andrew Jackson's threats seriously. He's already gained a reputation in 4 years of a guy you don't cross. So none of them join in. So South Carolina has no choice but to nullify nullification, and Vice President John C. Calhoun will never return to the White House. He will stay in South Carolina, and in the election of 1832, Andrew Jackson will pick a new running mate to replace the person he now detests, John C. Calhoun, and he'll select Martin Van Buren of New York State as his running mate, as we'll find out. Now, the next thing we need to talk about with the Jackson administration is building our way to the election of 1832 is the National Bank. Now, a little background information. We talked about the creation of the National Bank all the way back in the Washington administration, the brainchild of Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton. The National Bank, is chartered every 20 years. So there's a charter on the bank that's ready to expire in 1836. Now, some other background information, something we didn't even talk about previously because we were saving it for today. Back in 1819, we had a panic. Back in this day and age, that's what they called a recession or a depression. The Panic of 1819 was a depression, and it affected a lot of people, including Andrew Jackson. Before this depression, or panic as they called them back then, Andrew Jackson owned 2 plantations in Tennessee. Because of this, he lost one of them to the bank. They called in his loan. He never forgave the National Bank for that and detested them since then, blaming them for the panic and for the loss of one of his plantations. So Andrew Jackson is an enemy of the bank. Now, after the Panic of 1819, new leadership was selected for the National Bank because some of the criticisms Jackson had against him were valid. And they were under the leadership of the new bank president, Nicholas Biddle. Now, Nick Biddle did a very good job of reforming the bank, and the bank was in really good shape by 1832. But Nick Biddle knew there was one big obstacle he was facing, and that obstacle, and this is all covered on page 266 in your book, The Bank War. He knew. Now let me review for a second. The bank's charter, which is granted every 20 years, is going to expire in 1836. It's 1832, it's an election year. Nick Biddle, the bank president, is pretty positive Andrew Jackson's going to win re-election and probably win big and bring in a bunch of Democrat members of Congress on his presidential coattails, as they're known. So Nick Biddle is going to gamble. Nick Biddle decides to go to Congress in 1832 and have the bank charter renewed 4 years early because he figures it's his only shot. Because he knows if the bank is rechartered by Congress, Andrew Jackson, its enemy, will veto that bill. And he believes he has enough votes in the House and Senate in 1832 to override Jackson's veto. He knows by 1836 he probably won't. So he gets Congress to pass a new rechartering of the bank. It passes, and just as he expects, Andrew Jackson vetoes the National Bank. And in his famous veto speech of the bank, Jackson, as only Jackson could say, he's vetoing the bank because he deems it unconstitutional. Now, the Supreme Court, about, at least a dozen years earlier than this, in the famous case of McCulloch versus Maryland, had been asked that same question: is the national bank constitutional? And they said, yes, indeed it is. So this becomes a case of where Jackson thinks he can overrule the Supreme Court. So he vetoes the bank and then does everything in his power to make sure that Congress cannot override his veto. So the veto stands. The bank is not rechartered, and Jackson uses this as an opportunity to kill the bank once and for all. Because in the election of 1832, he's going to claim the number one issue that Americans are deciding upon in this election is whether or not to get rid of the bank. And that's what he's going to campaign on. In reality, most regular Americans could care less about the national bank, but Jackson's going to make it a false issue. So we'll pick up next lecture here momentarily after I take a break with the election of 1832, what happens to the bank, and carry on with Jackson's second term in office, because I'm giving it away, but you probably already know this. He wins re-election. So I'm going to take a break. I'll be back shortly. See you soon, class.